Any romantics among us this morning? We, as Kylie has mentioned, we have entered that month when we celebrate the love of Valentine's, don't we? Amen. Cupid and his arrows, and school children will pass out to classmates those little Valentine cards that you get at Walgreens, and sweethearts of all ages will give candy and flowers and go out for dinner, and some will whisper all that gushy-mushy love talk, right? And we will hear more love songs on the radio and maybe even read love poems. Our scripture focus today, which I will share in just a moment, contains a love poem. Now, it's sort of odd that Paul, the lifelong bachelor, not a guy known for his romantic sensibility, would insert a love poem into one of his letters. Paul, who said at one time, well, if the only alternative to your burning up with lust is to get married, then go ahead and get married, but only if you have to. You're better off staying single. That's what Paul said. But right there in the middle of his letter to the church at Corinth, we find a love poem. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is today most frequently read aloud at wedding ceremonies. I don't know how many weddings I have officiated over these 35 years of pastoral ministry, but I can safely say that in 85 to 90% of them, 1 Corinthians 13 is read. It is known as the Bible's love chapter and the one scripture read most often at weddings. I can't help but think of a wedding when I read 1 Corinthians 13, and I'm reminded of one of my favorite wedding stories. Now, some of you know this story. Bobby Stutler knows this story. And Bobby has a good wedding story herself. Ask her sometime about her wedding day. But Bobby and I were in a play several years back in which this story was told. Robert Fulgham, who is a Unitarian minister and writer and humorist, told this story in one of his books entitled "It Was on Fire When I Laid Down Upon It." And you have to read the little story where that title came from. But the story reminds us that weddings rarely go perfectly, do they? Now, Jean and I had a nice wedding some 29 plus years ago. I enjoyed our wedding, although Jean was a little stressed out, if you can imagine that. Her hair had not turned out like she had hoped, and she was stressed out about that. The person that had fixed her hair had made it sort of sit at an angle. It had a slope to it. And I told her, I said, honey, your hair looks beautiful, okay? But several days later, when we were looking at wedding pictures, I don't think I helped the matter when I said, well, you did sort of have a Gumby head, didn't you? But it was fine, and it was nothing like what happened at the wedding that Robert Fulgham writes about in his book. The title of this little story is the MOTB. He said he married people more than 1,000 times, but this particular wedding ever stood in his memory. He said the central figure in the drama was the mother of the bride. The MOTB. He said not the bride or the groom or the minister, the mother. He said usually she was a very polite, reasonable, intelligent, sane human being, but she had become mentally unhinged by the announcement of her daughter's betrothal. Nobody knew it, but this lady had been waiting with a script for a production that would have met with Cecil B. DeMille's approval. A royal wedding fit for a princess. She had spent months working on it down to every last detail, and he names all this stuff that she had done to prepare for the wedding. An 18-piece brass and wind ensemble was engaged. The bride's desires for home furnishings were registered in stores as far east as New York and south as Atlanta. Not only were the bridesmaids' outfits made to order, but the tuxes for the guys were made to order as well. He said, she had come unhinged. He said, looking back, it seems now that the rehearsal and the dinner on the evening before were a great event, but not unlike what took place in Napoleon's camp the night before Waterloo. But on the day of the wedding, the juggernaut of fate rolled down the road, and the final hour came, and guests in formal attire packed the church. There were enough candles lit to bring daylight back to evening. In the choir loft, the orchestra gushed great music, and the mighty MOTB coasted down the aisle with the grandeur of an opera diva at a premiere performance. Never did the bride of the mother take her seat with more satisfaction. She had done it. She glowed. She beamed. She smiled. The music softened, and 9 chiffon draped bridesmaids lockstep down the aisle while the befrocked groom and his men marched stolidly in place. But finally, so finally, the wedding march burst forth from the orchestra. Here comes the bride. The bride. She had been dressed for hours, if not days. There was no adrenaline left in her body. Left alone with her father in the reception hall of the church while the march of the maidens went on and on, she had walked along the tables laden with gourmet goodies and absent-mindedly sampled first the little pink and yellow and green mints, and then she picked through the silver bowls of mixed nuts and ate the pecans, followed by a cheese ball or two, some black olives, a handful of glazed almonds, a little sausage with a frilly toothpick in it, a couple of shrimps blanketed in bacon, and a cracker piled with liver pate. And to wash it all down, a glass of pink champagne. He said what you noticed as the bride stood in the doorway was not her dress, but her face. White. For what was coming down the aisle was a living grenade with the pin pulled out. The bride threw up. Just as she walked by her mother. And by throw up, he said, I don't mean a polite little lady like burp into her handkerchief. She puked. There's just no nice words for it. She hosed the front of the chancel, the two bridesmaids, the groom, the ring bearer, and me, he said. He said, I'm quite sure of the details. We have it all on videotape. There were 3 cameras. The MOTV had thought of everything, every angle. Having disgorged her hors d'oeuvres, her champagne, the last of her dignity, the bride went limp in her father's arms, while her groom sat down on the floor where he'd been standing too stunned to function, and the mother of the bride fainted, slumping over in ragdoll disarray. He said, well, we had a fire drill then and there at the front of that church that only the Marx brothers could have topped. Groomsmen rushed about heroically. Many princes, flower girls, squalled, bridesmaids sobbed, people with weak stomachs headed for the exits, all the while unaware the orchestra just continued to play on. The bride had not only come, but she was gone into some other state of consciousness, and the smell of you-know-what drifted across the church, mixed with the smell of guttering candles. Only 2 people were smiling. One was the mother of the groom, and the other was the father of the bride. Well, what do? He said, we went back to real life. Guests were invited to adjourn to the reception hall, though they did not eat or drink as much as they might have in different circumstances. The bride was consoled. She was cleaned up. She was fitted out with a bridesmaid dress. She was hugged and kissed a lot by the revived groom. And she'll always love him for that. When he said for better or for worse. Meant it. The cast was reassembled where we left off. A single flute played a quiet air. The words were spoken. The deed was done. Everybody cried, as people are supposed to do at weddings, mostly because the groom had held the bride in his arms through the whole ceremony. And no groom ever kissed a bride more tenderly. And they lived as happily ever after as anyone does, happier than most, in fact, for they've been married now for 12 years and have 3 lively children. But he said that's not the end of the story. The best part is still to come. For on the 10th anniversary of this disastrous affair, a party was held, 3 TV sets were mustered, a feast was laid, and best friends invited. And the event was hilarious, especially with the running commentary and the stop action stuff that's a little gross when it's seen one frame at a time. But the part that got cheers and toast was when the camera focused on the grin on the face of the father of the bride as he contemplated his wife as she's being revived. He said, the reason I say this, it's the best part, it's not because of the party, but because of who organized the party. Guess who organized the party? The MOTB. Mother of the bride, she's still at it, he said. A little looser these days. She not only forgave her husband and everybody else for their part in the debacle, she forgave herself, and nobody laughed harder at the film than she did. There's a word for that, he said, and it's called grace. I like that story. Now, I wouldn't necessarily want that kind of thing to happen in a wedding I was officiating, but I like how real the love is in that story. It's not all fairy tale, fancied up love, but it's here. Let me wipe the vomit off your chin kind of love. Right? Now, our native language of English is really a disadvantage to us when trying to capture what we mean when we say that word love. The Greeks, have 3 different words for our one word. Eros is the here's a box of Brussels Stovers, let me sing you a love song and whisper sweet nothings in your ear kind of love. Philios is the you are my best friend, my pal, my fishing buddy for life kind of love. But then there is agape, something that goes far beyond the 2 previous kind of loves. Agape is not so much a feeling that moves us to action, but it's more an action that we take, irregardless of our feelings. Agape is work. It's blood and sweat and tears. It's sacrifice and persistence and patience and putting up with and making hard choices. Agape is being a grown-up about things. Here in the Apostle Paul's first letter to the church in the city of Corinth in ancient Greece, Paul isn't happy with the behavior of the church members. If you can imagine church members, they were argumentative and divisive and pushy and petty. And he was embarrassed that they had given the places of honor to only the wealthy, and he was irked that their worship services were ruckus expressions of selfish behavior. Hey, look at me. So he wrote to tell them to stop acting up and to encourage them to do better. And in the 13th chapter, he takes time out to include a love poem. Not, of course, in the romantic sense, but a poem about mutual love and the give and take of godlike affection. An agape kind of love, and he says it's this way. It's like this. If I speak with human eloquence and angelic ecstasy, but don't love, I'm nothing but the creaking of a rusty gate. If I speak God's word with power, revealing all his mysteries and making everything plain as day, and if I have faith that says to a mountain jump, and that mountain jumps, but I don't have love, I'm nothing. If I give everything I own to the poor, and even go to the stake to be burned as a martyr, but I don't love, I've got nowhere. So no matter what I say, what I believe, and what I do, I'm bankrupt without love. For love never gives up. Love cares more for others than for self. Love doesn't want what it doesn't have. Love doesn't strut. It doesn't have a swelled head. It doesn't force itself on others. It isn't always me first. It doesn't fly off the handle. It doesn't keep score of the sins of others. It doesn't revel when others grovel. It takes pleasure in the flowering of truth. It puts up with anything. It trusts God always. It always looks for the best. It never looks back, but keeps going to the end. Love never dies. Inspired speech will be over someday. Praying in tongues will end. Understanding will reach its limit. We only know a portion of the truth, and what we say about God is always incomplete. But when the complete arrives, our incomplete will be canceled. For when I was an infant at my mother's breast, I gurgled and cooed like any infant, but when I grew up, I left those infant ways for good. You see, we don't see things clearly. We're squinting in a fog, peering through a mist, but it won't be long before the weather clears and the sun shines bright. We'll see it all then, see it as clearly as God sees us, knowing Him directly just as He knows us. But for right now, until that completeness, we have three things to do to lead us to that consummation. Trust steadily in God. Hope unswervingly. Love extravagantly. And the best of the three is love. That's what love is, actually. And there's nothing more important in all the world. You know, oftentimes we forget that. We make other things more important. But Paul says nothing is more important. The greatest of these is love. Sometimes things happen in life and we see clearly that nothing's more important than agape. Reverend Michael Bolts, pastor of West Collegiate Church in New York City, wrote about that when he said there's a line in the movie Love Actually that reminds us of this. He says the movie explores the different ways that love takes shape in our relationships, and in the opening scene, Hugh Grant's character says that whenever he is depressed, he imagines the arrival section of an airport. There, he says, love seems uncomplicated as people receive and embrace the ones they love. As he reflects on this, he adds, when the planes hit the Twin Towers, as far as I know, none of the phone calls from the people on board who knew what was coming were messages of hate or revenge. They were all messages of love. There may be different reasons we all ended up here today, but I hope that among them all, there's one reason we all share. And that is we've come here to experience the agape love of God and to learn how better to share and live that love. In just a moment, Caitlin is going to return with a song that invites us to the altar. We come this morning to the altar to share in a meal we call Holy Communion. This meal is modeled after the last meal Jesus shared on earth with his closest friends. You see, Jesus used this very common occasion of eating a meal together to convey to them and to all the world, including to us, what it means to love actually, to experience and share agape, where Jesus gives himself completely, sacrificially for us. Because you see, that's what the love of the Father